Now, we have had a lot of bad years in American history. 2020 will probably go down as one of them. But I would argue that there's not one year where we look like we're on the verge of chaos in America like 1968. 1968 is a tipping point. Last lesson you guys talked about and learned about the Tet Offensive, which is a major military victory for the United States. We should celebrate that. But the Tet Offensive is also a turning point. It's because the media and the American public starts to turn more and more against the war. We've been told from the start, looking at the body count, that we're on the verge of victory and the verge of winning Vietnam and preventing the spread of communism. Well, after the Tet Offensive, we find out that that's not the case. And there is no light at the end of the tunnel, and there is no end in sight. And the media stops portraying the war like we're on the verge of victory. In the last 3 units, we've talked about the power of the media to influence public opinion. We first found that way back in the 1950s, when Edward Murrow was able to expose the bully tactics of Joseph McCarthy and end McCarthyism in the United States. We learned about the first presidential debate, where the American public decided that JFK was the best leader of our country, not because he had the best answers, but because he had the best looks, and we preferred Kennedy over Nixon. Well, during the Vietnam War, the media has a huge influence on how Americans see and digest the war. We often call the war in Vietnam the living room war. And we use that phrase for 2 reasons. One, because a day-to-day basis plays out on television. We find out what's happening in the war almost in real time as it occurs. But also because the battle in America is taking place in the living room. And it's a battle between the generations. On one side we have what we will refer to as the silent majority. These are members of the greatest generation. A lot of these guys are the World War II vets. The guy who suffered for his country in Europe and in the Pacific during World War II. They're devout patriots, and they support the war in Vietnam. By this time, they're fathers. And in that same living room, they are sitting right next to their younger son, baby boomers. And these younger sons, they see the war and they see what's happening on television, and they interpret and perceive it with a lot more scrutiny. They're also the same young men who are in jeopardy of being drafted to fight in the war. And more, as the 1960s roll on, these guys do not support the war. In fact, they start thinking that the war is wrong. So when we're looking at the living room war, we're looking at a battle of generations, a deeply divided nation during the 1960s. And it's divided not only by political affiliation, but by age in the same families. The silent majority older Americans want us to win, but also want to retain the prestige of what the United States means. And the younger generation who become the new left and in some cases become hippies. They don't support the war. They think it's wrong. Another casualty of the Vietnam War is the presidency of Lyndon B. Johnson. When Lyndon B. Johnson was elected in 1964, it was a landslide victory. He sees this as the time to institute the Great Society in America and to fix all of our domestic problems. Well, Vietnam gets in the way for LBJ. And when we read these anti-war slogans, you can see how the American public turns on LBJ and it destroys his presidency. Here's some of them. Hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today? 1, 2, 3, 4, we don't want your, swear word, war. Draft beer, not boys. Hell no, we won't go. Make love, not war. 18 today, dead tomorrow. Some of the anti-war slogans on what became a very unpopular war in America. Now, in this lesson, you guys will read some other events which turn the American public, many of which are the youth, against the war. And you'll learn how in 1968, and moving into the 1970s, it was no longer a case of, is this a war we can win? It's, how quick can we get out of Vietnam?